FBI documents from the 1970s showed Jeffrey Epstein's name alongside known Mafia figures years before his mysterious wealth explosion. Most focused on his connections to politicians and celebrities, but few examined his possible ties to organized crime families. The path from high school math teacher to Wall Street power broker typically takes decades. Epstein did it in just a few years with no credentials. What, or who, was behind his inexplicable rise to power? In 1976, Jeffrey Epstein stood at the front of a classroom at the prestigious Dalton School in Manhattan, teaching calculus to the children of New York's elite. 6 years later, he occupied a luxurious office on Madison Avenue, controlling millions in assets and rubbing shoulders with Wall Street's power players. This transformation, from educator to financial magnate, happened with a speed that defied conventional explanation. Epstein's background contained no predictors for his financial success. He possessed none of the expected Wall Street credentials, no Ivy League degree, no MBA, not even a completed college education. His father worked for the New York City Parks Department, providing no connections to finance. Before his teaching position, his resume showed zero experience in investment banking or financial management. His trajectory resembled a scientific anomaly in the rigid financial ecosystem of 1980s New York. Wall Street firms recruited almost exclusively from elite business schools, with advancement following strict hierarchies requiring decades to navigate. How did Epstein bypass this entire system? What hidden forces propelled him past thousands of more qualified candidates? These questions lie at the heart of understanding his mysterious rise. The circumstances surrounding Epstein's entry into high finance raise serious questions. Bear Stearns hired him despite his complete lack of relevant qualifications. Former employees confirmed that similar positions demanded advanced finance degrees and years of industry experience, requirements Epstein simply didn't have. Even more perplexing was his relationship with Leslie Wexner, billionaire founder of The Limited. According to the official account, after a brief meeting, Wexner handed complete control of his vast fortune to Epstein, an unprecedented level of trust. Experienced financial advisors who managed similar fortunes consistently expressed shock at this arrangement, noting that billionaires typically employ teams of established professionals rather than trusting everything to a single unproven advisor. The timing of Epstein's career change coincided with troubling connections. FBI surveillance records from 1975 to 1978 document Epstein attending meetings at locations frequented by Genevieve's crime family associates, precisely when his financial career was forming. Banking records from his early Wall Street years reveal his initial clients included individuals flagged by regulatory authorities for suspicious transaction patterns matching money laundering operations, complex international transfers, unexplained cash deposits, and circular transactions that obscure the origin of funds. When compared with known mafia expansion strategies of that era, Epstein's rise follows a familiar pattern. During this period, crime families actively sought to diversify from traditional rackets into sophisticated financial operations. This shift required legitimate-appearing frontmen with clean backgrounds and intelligence who could interface with financial institutions without raising suspicions. The evidence suggests a disturbing reality. Rather than being a financial prodigy, Epstein may have functioned as something far darker, a calculated intermediary between criminal enterprises and legitimate financial systems. His sudden wealth and influence appears less like entrepreneurial genius and more like the strategic placement of a clean frontman for organized crimes expanding financial operations. Behind Epstein's facade of financial brilliance lay an operation that defied fundamental industry standards. When investigators finally gained access to his financial trust company headquarters, they discovered something that shattered the illusion of his wealth management empire. No trading floor, skeletal staff, and virtually no documentation of the billions supposedly under management. Financial Trust Company operated from an unmarked office in the U.S. Virgin Islands, while Epstein conducted business from his Manhattan townhouse, a highly unusual arrangement for managing billions in assets. This offshore registration allowed him to avoid the stringent regulatory oversight that would have been mandatory for a New York-based operation of comparable size. Former employees described a bizarrely sparse operation. One ex-assistant, speaking anonymously to financial investigators in 2019, stated, "We never saw client meetings, portfolio reviews, or investment committee discussions. The typical infrastructure you'd expect at even a mid-sized wealth management firm simply didn't exist." Where legitimate firms handling billions would employ dozens of analysts, researchers, and compliance specialists, Epstein operated with fewer than 10 core staff members. The financial industry maintains strict compliance protocols, documented investment strategies, transaction records, regular client communications, and audit trails. Banking experts have pointed out that Epstein's operation lacked these fundamental safeguards. Mark Williams, former Federal Reserve examiner, noted after reviewing available records, "The absence of a compliance department alone would immediately disqualify any legitimate firm from handling institutional wealth. The question isn't whether this was unusual, it's how it was permitted to continue." When pressed about his investment methodology, Epstein offered vague explanations about arbitrage opportunities and mathematical models. Financial experts analyzing these claims found them impossible to reconcile with the returns he reportedly generated. Dr. Stephen Taylor, financial mathematics professor at Columbia University, concluded, "The strategies Epstein described would require massive computing power and highly liquid markets to execute at scale. The infrastructure we know existed couldn't possibly support the operations he claimed." Banking records reveal another troubling pattern. Epstein maintained relationships with financial institutions repeatedly flagged for inadequate anti-money laundering protocols. Deutsche Bank, which handled Epstein's accounts until 2019, later paid a $150 million fine partly for compliance failures related to his accounts. A New York Department of Financial Services investigation found the bank processed hundreds of transactions that should have prompted additional scrutiny, including payments to individuals publicly alleged to be co-conspirators in his criminal activities. Financial investigators tracking the movement of funds through Epstein's network uncovered the hallmark of sophisticated money laundering: circular transactions. Money moved through a labyrinth of shell companies registered in secrecy jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, Panama, and Liechtenstein before returning to U.S. entities as seemingly legitimate investments. This technique, known as layering in anti-money laundering parlance, matches patterns documented in major mafia financial operations of the 1980s and 90s. Perhaps most telling was Epstein's unprecedented client arrangement. While top wealth managers typically charge 1 to 2% of assets under management, Epstein reportedly required complete financial control and flat fees of $1 million annually, regardless of portfolio size. His alleged minimum client threshold, billionaires only, conveniently limited his client pool to individuals who could absorb substantial fee structures without questioning unusual arrangements. When confronted by journalists about his client list, Epstein maintained rigid secrecy, claiming confidentiality requirements. Yet industry professionals note that legitimate wealth managers routinely disclose client categories and approximate assets under management without violating privacy protocols. Epstein's extraordinary secrecy exceeded normal business privacy considerations. Epstein's obsession with secrecy extended far beyond protecting wealthy clients. A 1978 FBI surveillance photograph reveals Epstein entering a known Genovese family restaurant in Manhattan, captured during a broader organized crime investigation. Why would a supposedly legitimate financial professional be meeting at a documented mafia gathering spot years before his mysterious wealth materialized? The implications of this photograph become clearer when connected to other evidence. Declassified FBI documents from RICO investigations in the 1970s mention Epstein's name multiple times alongside known mafia figures. The timing proves significant. These connections existed before his sudden wealth accumulation, establishing that influence flowed from organized crime to Epstein, not vice versa. Stephen Hoffenberg, who worked closely with Epstein in the 1980s before his conviction for running a massive Ponzi scheme, provided investigators with crucial context. In a 2019 prison interview, Hoffenberg stated unequivocally that Epstein was introduced to me through mutual associates who were connected to the Gambino and Genovese families. Hoffenberg further claimed these connections opened doors that would have otherwise remained closed to someone with his background. The paper trail of Epstein's earliest business ventures confirms these relationships. Property records from 1979 to 1981 show his first 3 Manhattan real estate investments involved buildings partially owned by Transcontinental Holdings Limited, a shell company later identified in a 1985 federal investigation as part of a Genovese family money laundering network. These transactions gave Epstein legitimate business credentials, while potentially enabling questionable financial movements. Former prosecutors have validated the significance of these connections. Andrew Karamanica, who served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York from 1977 to 1989, noted in a 2020 interview that Epstein's name appeared repeatedly in witness testimonies related to financial crimes investigations, targeting several organized crime families. He wasn't the target, but he was clearly in the orbit. The connections persisted throughout Epstein's career. His private jet flight logs show multiple trips between 1997 and 2005, with passengers identified in separate FBI documents as intermediaries for organized crime families. One passenger, appearing 17 times in the logs, was described in a 1998 FBI memorandum as a known facilitator for Gambino family financial operations in the Caribbean. During his time at Bear Stearns, according to Thomas Renfield, who worked in compliance there from 1977 to 1985, Epstein handled accounts for clients who couldn't pass standard background checks. He had a special arrangement with certain executives that exempted his clients from normal due diligence procedures. This service provided immense value to criminal organizations seeking legitimate banking relationships during increasing financial regulation. From his early Wall Street days through his later operation of his mysterious financial firm, Epstein maintained connections to organized crime figures that were systematic rather than casual. FBI documents establish a timeline suggesting these relationships formed the foundation of his operations. Richard Blumenthal, former U.S. Attorney for Connecticut who prosecuted multiple organized crime cases, observed, "When you see someone with Epstein's profile, no credentials, no clear source of wealth, unusual business practices, and documented connections to known criminal figures, it fits a very specific pattern we've observed in cases involving mob-affiliated financial facilitators." The financial facilitator's perfect fortress wasn't on Wall Street. It was hidden in plain sight in the Caribbean. In 1998, as federal regulators intensified their scrutiny of offshore banking networks, Epstein acquired Little St. James Island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The timing wasn't coincidental. That same year, Congress had passed the Money Laundering and Financial Crimes Strategy Act, dramatically increasing pressure on traditional havens for illicit funds. Epstein's island purchase provided something invaluable: a secure location beyond mainland jurisdiction, where sensitive financial operations could proceed with minimal oversight. The island's infrastructure revealed priorities beyond luxury accommodation. Former maintenance worker Miguel Rodriguez noted that Epstein invested millions in communication systems that seemed bizarrely sophisticated for a vacation property. He had satellite uplinks that could handle encrypted data streams and multiple redundant systems that seemed designed for financial trading, Rodriguez stated in a 2020 deposition. The basement of the main house contained what looked like a small bank branch, currency counting machines, document shredders, and a room-sized safe. The island's geographical position offered specific advantages beyond privacy. Financial crime specialist Catherine Novak pointed out, "The U.S. Virgin Islands exists in a unique regulatory space, American enough to seem legitimate while maintaining tax structures favorable to complex international transactions. Someone conducting financial operations there could access U.S. banking systems without triggering the same level of scrutiny as mainland transactions." Maritime records obtained through Freedom of Information requests reveal suspicious patterns of boat traffic. Between 2001 and 2008, Epstein's vessels made frequent journeys to rarely used ports in neighboring islands with minimal customs enforcement. Former Coast Guard officer James Harrington, who patrolled the area during this period, observed, "His boats would leave at odd hours, often after midnight, and return within a day. The pattern didn't match typical recreational sailing. It looked like courier runs." Visitors reported encounters that suggested business activities unrelated to Epstein's public persona. A former contractor who worked on the island's electrical systems in 2004 described witnessing meetings between Epstein and groups of men speaking Russian and Arabic, surrounded by financial documents. He added, "They weren't socializing. They looked like business transactions. When they noticed me, everything was quickly packed away." The island's security protocols went far beyond keeping out unwanted visitors. Staff described measures that appeared designed to protect sensitive information, rather than just ensuring privacy. Former security team member Thomas Wilkins revealed, "We conducted regular electronic sweeps for surveillance devices. Staff phones were collected before certain meetings. Some areas required biometric access, and specific rooms were designated as clean rooms, where no electronic devices were permitted." These protocols mirror those used in high-level financial institutions handling sensitive trading information or intelligence facilities rather than private residences. When federal agents finally raided Little St. James in 2019, they discovered sophisticated technological infrastructure. According to court documents, authorities seized multiple devices containing specialized encryption software typically used for secure financial transactions. Digital forensics expert Dr. Sarah Mitchell explained, "The type of encryption found on Epstein's devices is rarely seen in personal use. It's the kind utilized by banking institutions for secure international transfers, or by corporations protecting proprietary trading algorithms." The island also featured underground facilities that remained largely unexplained. Construction records indicate substantial excavation work between 2000 and 2002 that created subterranean spaces not reflected in publicly filed building permits. Former island employee Lucia Vasquez stated in a 2020 interview, "There were areas staff weren't allowed to access. The underground sections had separate power systems and their own air conditioning units that ran constantly. Whatever happened down there required continuous climate control." Most telling were the document destruction capabilities. Beyond standard paper shredders, the island contained an industrial incinerator typically found in medical facilities or secure government installations. The capacity to destroy evidence quickly and completely would be particularly valuable for someone conducting sensitive financial operations, noted former FBI financial crimes investigator Robert Mazur. Combined with the island's isolation, it created the perfect environment for handling transactions that couldn't risk documentation. While document destruction provided Epstein's physical security, his most impenetrable protection came from institutional sources. The 2007 non-prosecution agreement he secured in Florida remains one of the most extraordinary legal arrangements in modern criminal justice. A deal so favorable it shocked even veteran defense attorneys who reviewed its terms. When federal investigators had compiled evidence from over 30 victims and prepared a 53-page indictment that could have put Epstein away for life, something unprecedented happened. The case essentially vanished. Former Miami Herald investigative journalist Julie Brown, who spent years examining the case, described it as, "Unlike anything I've seen in my 30-year career." The prosecutors didn't just offer a lenient deal, they effectively shut down an entire federal investigation. The agreement, negotiated by Epstein's high-powered legal team that included Alan Dershowitz and former special prosecutor Kenneth Starr, granted immunity not just to Epstein, but contained an unusual provision shielding any potential co-conspirators from prosecution. This blanket protection extended to unnamed individuals who might have facilitated or participated in his criminal enterprise, language rarely seen outside organized crime cases. Marie Villafaña, the lead prosecutor initially assigned to the case, later revealed she was sidelined by unusual interference. "There were numerous communications happening outside normal channels," she stated in a 2020 Justice Department review. "I was instructed to stand down on certain investigative avenues without explanation." This pattern of obstruction extended beyond the Florida case. The New York Police Department's investigation into Epstein in the early 2000s similarly hit mysterious roadblocks. Detective Joseph Reckery, who led the initial Palm Beach investigation, described finding evidence of an extensive operation with dozens of victims. "We had victims, we had witnesses, we had physical evidence, we had schedules," Reckery stated before his death in 2018. Then suddenly, doors started closing. Financial regulators exhibited the same pattern of inexplicable inaction. Despite Epstein's company lacking standard compliance structures, the Securities and Exchange Commission never launched a significant investigation into his operations. For a financial entity handling purportedly billions in assets to operate with such minimal oversight defies explanation, noted former SEC enforcement attorney Elizabeth Williams. The red flags were numerous and obvious enough to trigger automatic regulatory review. This protection extended internationally. In 2010, after Epstein's conviction as a sex offender, he maintained his ability to travel freely to numerous countries that typically restrict entry for registered sex offenders. Immigration officials in multiple nations appeared to make exceptions for him that violated their standard protocols. Former intelligence operative Robert David Steele suggested a more sinister explanation in a 2019 interview. Epstein claimed connections to multiple intelligence agencies as a form of insurance policy. This tactic mirrors a protection strategy used by high-level organized crime figures since the 1960s, when intelligence agencies began formal relationships with certain mafia assets. The most compelling evidence of Epstein's leverage came from his extensive surveillance systems. When authorities finally raided his Manhattan mansion in 2019, they discovered hidden cameras throughout the residence, with an elaborate system for recording and storing compromising material of high-profile visitors. The setup wasn't amateur, noted NYPD detective Marco Carrillo, who participated in the raid. This was a professional surveillance operation designed to capture material that could be weaponized. Victims' attorneys have alleged that Epstein's entire operation functioned partly as a sophisticated blackmail scheme. Attorney Bradley Edwards, who represented numerous Epstein victims, stated, "Many of the girls were specifically instructed on how to behave with certain guests, what to wear, what to ask about, and to report back everything that happened." Classic intelligence gathering. This systematic collection of compromising material wasn't just reminiscent of intelligence operations. It mirrored strategies long employed by another organization, the Mafia. As organized crime evolved from street rackets to sophisticated financial operations in the 1980s and 90s, they needed a new kind of fixer with different skills and connections than their predecessors. The traditional mafia consigliere, or advisor, served as a bridge between criminal enterprises and legitimate society. These fixers typically had some level of education, social connections beyond the crime family, and the ability to navigate between worlds. By the late 1980s, however, this role required transformation as organized crime sought to penetrate the increasingly complex financial sector. Dr. Antonio Nicasso, author of Business or Blood Mafia boss Vito Rizzuto's Last War, explained, "The modern mafia needed individuals who could open doors to high finance that were traditionally closed to known criminal associates. They required someone with impeccable social credentials who could move in circles far beyond their reach." This evolution coincided perfectly with Epstein's emergence. Unlike the gruff fixers of previous generations, Epstein presented as polished, intellectual, and connected to legitimate power structures, precisely what criminal organizations needed as they modernized their operations. FBI Special Agent Richard Mathers, who specialized in organized crime financial operations from 1985 to 2007, observed, "We began noticing a new pattern in the mid-90s where sophisticated criminal organizations stopped using their own people for financial operations. Instead, they cultivated relationships with legitimate-appearing financial specialists who had clean records but flexible ethics. These individuals became the most valuable assets in modern organized crime." Epstein's particular genius was his ability to traverse multiple exclusive social circles simultaneously. He maintained relationships with Nobel Prize-winning scientists and academics at Harvard, while also mingling with European aristocracy and Wall Street power brokers. This range of connections would have been extraordinarily valuable for criminal enterprises seeking both legitimacy and investment opportunities. Former U.S. Attorney Samuel Buell noted, "The most sophisticated money laundering operations require three things: specialized financial knowledge, access to legitimate institutions, and protection mechanisms." When we prosecuted organized crime cases in the 1990s, we discovered they were increasingly using single operators who could provide all three services rather than maintaining separate specialists. The timing of Epstein's rise also coincided with significant changes in banking regulations that dramatically affected criminal enterprises. The Money Laundering Control Act of 1986 and subsequent legislation created substantial new barriers for criminal organizations trying to integrate illegal proceeds into the legitimate economy. Professor William Black, former banking regulator and white-collar crime expert, explained, "When these laws passed, criminal organizations faced a crisis. Their traditional money movement techniques no longer worked. They urgently needed financial operators who understood the new regulatory environment and could navigate around it." Epstein's specialized knowledge of offshore structures, private banking, and tax avoidance strategies provided exactly the capabilities criminal organizations suddenly required. His establishment of operations in jurisdictions with minimal oversight, particularly the U.S. Virgin Islands, reflected this specialized expertise. Criminal organizations have historically required both financial services and leverage to protect their operations. The traditional mafia collected compromising information on politicians, judges, and business leaders as insurance. Epstein's systematic gathering of compromising material on powerful individuals followed this same operational logic but with modern sophistication. Former Organized Crime Task Force prosecutor Maria Gonzalez observed, "What made certain fixers especially valuable to criminal organizations wasn't just their financial skills, it was their ability to cultivate relationships that could be leveraged for protection. The most effective fixers created situations where powerful people became compromised, ensuring they would intervene if investigations got too close." This dual capability, financial services combined with compromising material, represents the evolution of the traditional fixer role into a more sophisticated form, suited for the modern era. As banking technology and global finance grew more complex in the 1990s and 2000s, criminal organizations required operators with precisely Epstein's profile, connections, and capabilities. While Epstein's financial expertise and connections positioned him as a powerful figure, his ability to operate in elite circles was significantly enhanced by one person, Ghislaine Maxwell. The daughter of British media mogul Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine was more than just Epstein's close associate. She was a key enabler of his network and may have played a role far more strategic than widely understood. Maxwell's background provided her with unparalleled access to global elites. Through her father's influence, she was well connected to British royalty, high-ranking politicians, intelligence agencies, and global financiers. After Robert Maxwell's mysterious death in 1991, amid allegations that he had worked with intelligence agencies, Ghislaine relocated to New York and became Epstein's closest confidant. Maxwell wasn't just Epstein's socialite companion. She was the person who introduced him to some of the most powerful people in the world. Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton, and numerous Wall Street executives all moved in the same circles Maxwell curated. Without her, Epstein would have struggled to access these networks. Former CIA officer John Kiriakou has suggested that Maxwell's role in Epstein's operation mirrors the tactics used in honey trap intelligence operations, where compromising material is collected to ensure influence and control. Maxwell, with her European aristocratic connections, could have provided both legitimacy and cover for Epstein's illicit dealings. Multiple sources indicate that Maxwell wasn't merely an accomplice. She may have been more involved in the logistics of Epstein's operations than he was himself. Victims have testified that Maxwell actively recruited and groomed young women for Epstein. This level of hands-on involvement suggests she wasn't just following Epstein's orders. She was a central figure in the operation. Intelligence journalist Seymour Hersh has pointed out that Maxwell's connections to both Western and Israeli intelligence circles raise the question: was Epstein running a blackmail operation on behalf of someone else? And if so, was Maxwell his handler? Maxwell's role in Epstein's financial network beyond recruitment, Maxwell was also linked to Epstein's financial dealings. In 2020, court documents revealed that Maxwell controlled offshore bank accounts with millions of dollars, raising the possibility that she was managing financial assets for the operation. Investigators have noted that Epstein's financial empire had all the hallmarks of a sophisticated money laundering network, utilizing offshore jurisdictions with minimal oversight. Maxwell's involvement in these transactions strengthens the argument that Epstein wasn't acting alone. If Epstein was an evolution of the traditional mafia fixer, Maxwell may have been an evolution of the classic intelligence asset, someone who blended high society connections, financial secrecy, and blackmail-based power accumulation. Her 2021 conviction may have closed one chapter of this story, but the larger network of individuals who benefited from Epstein and Maxwell remains largely untouched. The real question is, who else was involved and who is still operating today? When we step back and analyze the full scope of evidence, a troubling conclusion emerges. The connections between Epstein and organized crime figures, while circumstantial, form a coherent pattern that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Epstein's operation, with its offshore structure, minimal documentation, and sophisticated encryption, mirrors the evolution of organized crime's financial mechanics in the digital age. Today, other Epstein-like figures likely operate in plain sight, managing seemingly legitimate enterprises while facilitating the movement of illicit funds. They blend seamlessly into elite circles, using prestigious connections as both shield and leverage. Their power derives not from street violence, but from compromising information and financial entanglement. The true danger lies in our collective blindness to these operations. By recognizing the pattern Epstein represents, the modern criminal facilitator who bridges underworld and upperworld, we gain the ability to identify similar operations before they accumulate decades of unchecked influence. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, hit the subscribe button, and tap the bell for a deeper look into the criminal world. Let us know in the comments if there's any crime stories you'd like us to cover on Crime Republic. Until next time.